The sound that saved hundreds of lives wasn't a gunshot, a siren, or a radio transmission. It was the ringing of church bells in a small Polish town that most maps had forgotten. In the winter of 1943, while the Gestapo tightened their grip around the throats of every occupied village, one man turned the oldest form of communication into the most dangerous weapon of resistance. His name was Josef Novak, a 52-year-old bell ringer who had spent 3 decades pulling the same ropes in the same tower, creating melodies that marked baptisms, weddings, and funerals. But when the Nazis arrived, those same bells began to speak a language that only the hunted could understand. The question you need to ask yourself is this: how many times can you ring a church bell before the executioners realize you're not calling people to prayer, but warning them to run for their lives? This story takes place in Wieliczka, a town 30 kilometers southeast of Krakow, known for its ancient salt mines that stretched like catacombs beneath the earth. By 1943, Poland had been under German occupation for nearly 4 years, and the machinery of the Holocaust was operating at full capacity. The Gestapo had established a permanent presence in every significant town, their black leather coats and Mercedes sedans becoming symbols of terror that froze blood in veins. In Wieliczka, the headquarters sat in a requisitioned manor house on the town square, directly across from St. Clement's Church, where Josef had rung the bells since 1913. The proximity was both a curse and an opportunity. The Germans could hear every note that echoed from that tower, which meant Josef's communications had to be hidden in plain sight, camouflaged within the daily rhythms of Catholic tradition that even the Nazis wouldn't dare interrupt completely. Josef Novak was not a warrior, a spy, or a trained resistance fighter. He was a widower with arthritis in his left hand, a man whose entire world consisted of 147 stone steps leading to a bell tower, 3 bronze bells cast in 1768, and a view of red-tiled roofs that stretched toward the Carpathian Mountains. His daughter had fled to England before the invasion, and his son had been killed in the defense of Warsaw during the first weeks of the war. Josef had nothing left to lose, which made him the most dangerous kind of person in occupied Europe. Someone with knowledge, access, and absolutely no fear of death. He knew every family in Wieliczka, understood the ebb and flow of the town's heartbeat, and most importantly, he had spent 30 years creating patterns that everyone recognized. When the bells rang at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening, it was as natural as breathing. When they rang differently, people noticed. The system began by accident in March of 1943. Josef had spotted a convoy of 3 Gestapo vehicles approaching from the Krakow road while he was in the tower for the noon Angelus. Below, in the narrow streets near the synagogue ruins, he knew that several Jewish families were hiding in cellars, protected by Polish neighbors who risked execution for their compassion. Without thinking, Josef began to ring the bells in a pattern he had never used before. 3 rapid strikes, a pause, 3 more rapid strikes, another pause, then the normal Angelus sequence. It wasn't sophisticated, but it was different enough that Anna Wojcik, a young woman who worked with the underground, understood something was wrong. She ran through the streets, knocking on specific doors with a coded tap. And by the time the Gestapo began their sweep, the cellars were empty and the hunted had vanished into the salt mines below. That first success planted a seed that would grow into an elaborate network of acoustic signals. Josef began working with Father Tomasz Kowalski and members of the local resistance to develop a language of bells that could communicate specific threats. A certain rhythm meant Gestapo was coming from the east. Another pattern indicated a random inspection. A third warned of arrests planned for that night. The beauty of the system was its deniability. Bells had rung in European towns for 1,000 years, marking time and tradition, and Josef could always claim he was simply fulfilling his duties as a church servant. The Germans heard the bells every day, their sounds becoming background noise to their occupation, never suspecting that the old man in the tower was orchestrating an invisible evacuation network right under their noses. But systems built on sound are fragile, and in the paranoid mathematics of Nazi-occupied Poland, patterns eventually draw attention. By August of 1943, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber, the Gestapo officer in charge of Wieliczka, began to notice something he couldn't quite articulate: a correlation between unusual bell sequences and the frustrating emptiness of his raids. People seemed to disappear moments before his men arrived, as if the very air was warning them. Weber was not a stupid man, and he started to keep a notebook, logging the times and patterns of the bells, searching for the code hidden in the ancient bronze. The hunter was learning to hear what Josef was saying, and the tower that had protected so many was about to become a trap. The transformation of Wieliczka, from a sleepy mining town into a pressure cooker of fear, happened gradually, then all at once. When the Germans first arrived in September of 1939, they were almost polite, requisitioning homes and supplies with bureaucratic efficiency rather than brutality. But by 1942, the mask had completely fallen away. The deportations to concentration camps began in waves, each one more violent than the last. Jewish families who had lived in Wieliczka for generations were rounded up in the town square, forced into cattle cars, and sent east to places whose names would become synonymous with hell: Auschwitz, Belzec, Treblinka. The Poles who remained lived under a regime of collective punishment, where one act of resistance could result in 10, 20, or 50 executions. Curfews were enforced with bullets, food rations calculated to keep people weak, and the Gestapo cultivated networks of informants who sold their neighbors' lives for extra bread, or the promise of safety that never came. Josef watched this descent into darkness from his tower, and the view changed him in ways that surprised even himself. He had always been a quiet man, someone who preferred the company of bells to people, who found his prayers in the mechanical repetition of pulling ropes and listening to bronze sing across the rooftops. But when you watch children being torn from their mother's arms in a town square, when you see elderly men beaten for the crime of existing, when the smell of smoke from burning homes becomes as common as morning mist, something breaks inside you, or it forges you into something harder. Josef became harder. He stopped sleeping more than 3 or 4 hours a night, spending his time in the tower with a pair of binoculars he had taken from his dead son's military kit, scanning the roads that led into Wieliczka from every direction. He memorized the schedules of German patrols, learned to distinguish between routine inspections and the focused hunts that preceded mass arrests, and began to understand that his elevated position gave him something invaluable in a world gone mad: advance warning. The incident that truly catalyzed the bell code system happened on a cold morning in early March of 1943. Josef had climbed the tower before dawn, as was his habit, to prepare for the 6 o'clock call to morning mass. Through his binoculars, he spotted something unusual on the Krakow road: a convoy of vehicles moving slowly, deliberately, the kind of procession that meant serious business rather than routine patrol. He counted 5 trucks and 2 staff cars, enough to transport perhaps 50 Gestapo officers and SS soldiers. They were still 3 kilometers away, which gave him perhaps 15 minutes before they reached the town center. Below him, Josef knew that at least a dozen Jewish families were hiding in the cellars and attics of Polish homes throughout the old quarter, including the Lewandowski family tucked behind a false wall in the bakery, and the Rosenberg children concealed in a coal shed behind the butcher shop. If the Germans conducted a thorough sweep, they would find them, and everyone involved would die. Josef's hands moved before his conscious mind fully registered what he was doing. Instead of the traditional 6 slow measured peals that announced morning mass, he grabbed the rope for the smallest bell and began a rapid staccato pattern: 3 quick rings, silence, 3 more, silence. Then he switched to the largest bell for one deep, resonant boom that seemed to shake the morning air. It was completely wrong, a violation of every protocol and tradition that had governed church bells for centuries, and that was precisely the point. Down in the streets, Anna Wojcik was leaving her apartment to begin her shift at the town hall, where she worked as a clerk while secretly passing information to the resistance. She heard the pattern and froze, her mind racing to interpret what Josef was trying to communicate. She had grown up in this town, had heard these bells every day of her life, and this sequence was alien, urgent, wrong, in a way that made her heart accelerate. Anna made a decision in that moment that would save lives, but also set in motion a chain of events that would eventually doom Josef. She began to run. Within 12 minutes, the warning had spread through the underground network like electricity through copper wire. Anna knocked on the door of the bakery using a specific rhythm, 3 short, 2 long, and when Pan Kowalski opened it, she whispered a single word, "Now." He understood immediately, disappeared inside, and within minutes the Lewandowski family was moving through a tunnel that connected the bakery's cellar to the entrance of the salt mines 2 blocks away. The same scene repeated itself across the old quarter, a choreographed evacuation that looked like chaos, but was actually the result of months of planning for exactly this scenario. By the time the Gestapo convoy rolled into the town square and soldiers began kicking down doors, the rabbits had vanished into their warrens, leaving behind only empty hiding places and the lingering smell of fear. The Germans found nothing, and Hauptsturmführer Weber stood in the square, his face darkening with rage, while above him the bells of St. Clement's Church rang the traditional morning mass sequence as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The success of that first warning created both hope and danger in equal measure. Within days, Father Tomasz Kowalski climbed the 147 steps to Josef's tower, ostensibly to discuss the schedule for upcoming holy days, but really to propose something far more dangerous. The priest was a complicated man, caught between his vows to God and his obligations to the suffering people of his parish. He had watched the Nazis desecrate his church, forcing him to remove Jewish converts from parish records and forbidding him from sheltering those the regime had marked for death. But Thomas had discovered that there were ways to resist that didn't require guns or bombs, acts of defiance hidden inside the rituals and routines that even the Germans hesitated to completely destroy. He sat with Josef in the cramped bell tower, surrounded by ropes and timber beams carved with the names of bell ringers going back 200 years, and he asked a question that would transform a spontaneous act into a systematic operation. Could Josef do it again, but with intention, with patterns that the resistance could learn to read like a language? Josef understood immediately what the priest was proposing, and he also understood the mathematics of his own death. If he agreed, if he turned the bells into a communication system, he would eventually be caught. The Gestapo were many things, but they were not stupid, and patterns draw attention the way blood draws sharks. Yet Josef also understood something else. He was 52 years old. His wife was dead, his son was dead, his daughter was beyond his protection in England, and the arthritis in his hands was getting worse every winter. He had perhaps 10 or 15 years left if he was lucky, and those years would be spent under Nazi occupation, watching his town bleed, watching children disappear, watching the world he had known for 5 decades get systematically erased. The choice, when he examined it honestly, was between dying slowly of bitterness and irrelevance or dying quickly with the knowledge that he had saved lives. Josef looked at the priest and nodded once, a simple gesture that contained within it a death sentence and a declaration of war. The development of the code took 3 weeks and involved 5 members of the resistance meeting in the church sacristy after midnight, speaking in whispers, while Josef demonstrated what was possible with 3 bells of different sizes and tones. The largest bell, cast in 1768 and named St. Clement after the church's patron, produced a deep resonant tone that could be heard throughout the entire town and well into the surrounding countryside. The middle bell, St. Barbara, had a brighter, clearer voice that cut through rain and wind. The smallest bell, simply called the Angelus bell, created a rapid chiming that could convey urgency. By combining these 3 voices in different patterns, rhythms, and sequences, Josef could theoretically communicate a limited vocabulary of warnings. 3 rapid chimes from the Angelus bell, followed by 2 deep tolls of St. Clement, meant Gestapo approaching from the Krakow road. A slow alternation between St. Barbara and St. Clement indicated routine patrol, no immediate danger. 4 rapid chimes pause. 4 more rapid chimes meant raids planned for tonight hide now. The system had to be simple enough for ordinary people to remember under stress, but complex enough to convey useful information and flexible enough to be disguised within legitimate bell ringing. Josef proposed that he would always begin and end with traditional sequences, the calls to Mass, and the Angelus prayers that had governed church bells for centuries, but embedded within those familiar patterns would be the warnings. To an untrained ear, it might sound like the old bell ringer was simply taking longer than usual or adding flourishes to the traditional melodies. To those who knew the code, every extra chime, every unusual pause, every deviation from the norm carried meaning that could mean the difference between life and death. The resistance members memorized the patterns, then went out and taught them to trusted families, creating a network of listeners who would snap to attention whenever the bells sang anything other than their expected songs. The first month of the operational code system saved an estimated 37 lives, though the exact number was impossible to verify in a world where people disappeared and reappeared like ghosts. Josef rang warnings for 4 separate Gestapo raids, 3 random inspections, and 2 nights when the SS conducted door-to-door searches for contraband and hidden Jews. Each time the bells spoke their secret language, and each time the hunted managed to stay one step ahead of the hunters. The system worked so well that the resistance began to rely on it completely, building their evacuation plans around the assumption that Josef would always be in his tower, always watching the roads, always ready to pull those ropes and send warnings echoing across the rooftops. This reliance, this assumption of invulnerability, was the first crack in a system that was never designed to last forever, but only to buy time in a world where time was the most precious commodity anyone possessed. The life of a bell ringer in occupied Poland became a peculiar form of warfare that required no weapons, only vigilance and nerves that never rested. Josef developed routines that would have seemed obsessive to an outside observer, but were actually survival protocols, disguised as the habits of an old man. He arrived at the tower every morning at 4:30, a full 90 minutes before the first scheduled ringing, climbing those 147 stone steps in darkness, with knees that protested every ascent. Once in the tower, he would position himself at the western window with his binoculars and begin the watch, scanning the 3 main roads that connected Wieliczka to the outside world. He learned to read the landscape like a text, understanding that dust clouds on dry days meant vehicles approaching, that the flight patterns of crows could indicate unusual activity in the forests, that the absence of farmers in fields during working hours suggested they had been warned to stay inside. His entire existence narrowed to patterns and their disruptions. Josef knew that the German supply trucks arrived every Tuesday and Friday at approximately 10 in the morning, that the Gestapo changed shifts at the headquarters across the square at 8, 14, and 22 hours, that Hauptsturmführer Weber took his lunch at precisely 13 hours, and his staff car was always parked in the same spot. This knowledge allowed Josef to distinguish between the routine machinery of occupation and the exceptional movements that signaled danger. When an extra vehicle appeared in a convoy, when patrols deviated from their usual routes, when soldiers gathered in unusual numbers at the headquarters, Josef's instincts would trigger and his hands would move toward the ropes. He developed an almost supernatural sensitivity to aberration, the way a sailor can sense a storm building beyond the horizon, and this sensitivity kept the network alive through the spring and summer of 1943. But the constant vigilance extracted a terrible price from Josef's body and mind. He stopped attending meals with other church staff, instead eating stale bread and hard cheese in the tower while maintaining his watch. His sleep became fragmented, never more than 2 hours at a time, because he had trained himself to wake at the slightest unusual sound, vehicles in the night, shouting in German, the metallic click of rifles being loaded. His hands, already compromised by arthritis, began to develop calluses and then open sores from pulling the heavy ropes multiple times each day. Father Tomasz tried to convince him to take breaks, to share the duty with others, but Josef refused with a stubbornness that bordered on fanaticism. He had memorized the code, understood the nuances of each warning, and more importantly, he had developed an almost psychic connection to the rhythms of the occupation. No one else could read the signs as quickly or as accurately, and in a system where 15 minutes of advance warning meant the difference between escape and capture, those extra minutes of recognition time were everything. The toll was not just physical, but psychological. Josef began to experience a form of hypervigilance that modern doctors would recognize as a symptom of trauma, but which he simply understood as the price of his mission. Every sound made him flinch. Every shadow could be a Gestapo agent. Every unfamiliar face in the town square might be an informant mapping the network. He stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary, communicating with Father Tomasz and Anna through notes passed during confession or brief whispered conversations in the sacristy after midnight mass. His world contracted to the dimensions of the bell tower. The view through his binoculars, the weight of the ropes in his damaged hands, and the terrible responsibility of knowing that people lived or died based on his ability to stay awake, stay alert, stay one step ahead of the machine that wanted to grind them all into dust. By September of 1943, Josef had been operating the bell code system for 6 months, and the strain was evident to anyone who bothered to look closely. His face had become gaunt, carved down to essential angles of cheekbone and jaw. His eyes had developed a haunted quality, perpetually scanning, never at rest, darting from face to face as if searching for betrayal in every expression. His hands shook when they were not gripping the bell ropes, a tremor that started in his fingers and sometimes spread up his arms. But the system worked, and the evidence of its success was written in negative space. The families who were not deported, the children who were not murdered, the resistance members who were not arrested. Josef had become a ghost, haunting his own tower, barely alive but absolutely essential, a human early warning system whose continued existence was the only thing standing between the hunted and the hunters who never stopped searching. Hauptsturmführer Klaus Weber was not the typical brute that often rose through the ranks of the SS. He had studied mathematics at the University of Heidelberg before the war, and his mind worked in patterns, probabilities, and statistical anomalies. When he first arrived in Wieliczka in January of 1943, he approached the occupation with the same methodical precision he had once applied to complex equations. Weber kept detailed records of every raid, every arrest, every search operation, noting locations, times, outcomes, and any irregularities. By late August, after 6 months of frustratingly empty raids, he began to notice something that his less analytical colleagues had missed: a correlation between certain bell patterns and the sudden absence of targets. It was not obvious, not direct enough to prove causation, but the coincidences were accumulating in ways that his mathematical training told him were statistically improbable. Weber started his own surveillance operation, one that had nothing to do with Jews or resistance fighters, and everything to do with understanding the invisible communication network he suspected existed in Wieliczka. He requisitioned a room in the headquarters that faced St. Clement's Church and began logging every bell sequence he heard, noting the time, duration, pattern, and any deviations from what he understood to be normal church bell protocol. He had never been religious, had always viewed the Catholic rituals of Poland as superstitious theatre, but now he forced himself to learn the legitimate patterns: the Angelus at 6, 12, and 18 hours, the calls to Mass, the tolling for funerals, the celebrations for feast days. Once he understood the baseline, the anomalies became visible. 3 rapid chimes embedded in an otherwise normal Angelus sequence. An unusually long pause between tolls during evening prayers. A single deep ring of the largest bell at times when no religious ceremony was scheduled. The Hauptsturmführer began testing his hypothesis with controlled experiments that would have made his university professors proud, but which in practice meant gambling with human lives as if they were data points. He would schedule a raid, but delay its execution by 30 minutes, watching to see if the bells rang anything unusual during that waiting period. When they did, he would cancel the raid and observe whether his targets remained in place or disappeared. The results confirmed his suspicions with uncomfortable consistency. When the bells sang their strange songs, people vanished, and when the bells remained silent, his raids succeeded. By mid-September, Weber was certain he had identified the mechanism of communication, though he had not yet identified the communicator or cracked the specific code. He knew the bells were speaking, but he did not yet know what they were saying or who was controlling the conversation. Weber's next step was to identify the bell ringer, which proved easier than cracking the code itself. A few discreet questions to the local Polish administrators revealed that St. Clement's had only one bell ringer, an old man named Josef Novak, who had held the position for 3 decades and who practically lived in the tower. Weber began watching Josef with the same intensity that Josef had been watching the roads. He observed the bell ringer's arrivals and departures, noted his interactions with Father Tomasz and various parish members, and most tellingly, he noticed that Josef arrived at the tower hours before any scheduled bell ringing and remained there long after his duties required. The old man was watching something, and Weber understood with the clarity of mathematical proof that Josef Novak was not just ringing bells according to religious tradition, but conducting an operation that had undermined German authority for 6 months. The problem for Weber was evidence and exposure. He could not simply arrest Josef without proof, because the bell ringer could claim he was merely fulfilling his religious duties, and any move against a church official without clear justification would create problems with both the local population and the German administration that preferred to maintain a veneer of civilized occupation. More importantly, if Weber arrested Josef, he would shut down the communication network, but he would not capture the larger resistance organization that relied on it. What Weber wanted was not just to stop the bells, but to use them as bait, to force the resistance into the open by manipulating the very system they trusted. He began formulating a plan that was elegant in its cruelty. He would let Josef continue ringing his warnings, but he would feed the old man false information, turn the bells into a weapon that would trap rather than save, and use the trust the resistance had in their bell ringer to destroy them all at once. The trap was set on a cold morning in late September, when the first hints of autumn were turning the leaves gold and crimson across the Carpathian foothills. Weber orchestrated what appeared to be a routine supply convoy, 5 trucks moving slowly along the Krakow road at precisely the time when Josef would be in his tower preparing for the noon Angelus. But this convoy was theatre, a performance designed for an audience of one. Weber positioned himself in the headquarters with binoculars trained not on the road but on the bell tower, waiting to see if Josef would take the bait. The trucks moved at half their normal speed, deliberately visible, deliberately suspicious, carrying soldiers who had been instructed to look alert and ready for action. It was a convoy that screamed raid incoming to anyone trained to read such signs, and Weber was betting that Josef's instincts would override his caution. Josef saw the convoy at 11:45, 15 minutes before the scheduled Angelus. Through his binoculars, he counted the vehicles, noted the unusual number of soldiers visible in the truck beds, observed the slow, deliberate pace that suggested they were preparing to deploy rather than simply passing through. Every indicator suggested a major operation, possibly the largest raid Wieliczka had seen in months. His hands moved toward the ropes automatically, muscle memory overriding the small voice of doubt that whispered in the back of his mind. Something felt wrong about this convoy, too visible, too obvious. But Josef had learned over 6 months that hesitation cost lives. He made his decision and began the warning sequence. 4 rapid chimes of the Angelus bell, pause, 4 more chimes, then a smooth transition into the normal noon Angelus, as if the extra rings were simply enthusiastic preparation for the main event. Down in the streets, the warning spread through the network with practiced efficiency. Anna heard it from her desk at the town hall and immediately left, claiming illness to her German supervisor. She moved through the old quarter with apparent casualness, stopping at specific doors, delivering the message with subtle gestures and coded phrases. Within 20 minutes, cellars were emptying, false walls were closing, and the human cargo that the Gestapo had been hunting for months was flowing toward the salt mines like water, finding cracks in stone. The resistance had executed this evacuation dozens of times, and they moved with the confidence of a well-rehearsed performance. What none of them knew was that Weber's trucks never stopped, never deployed soldiers, never conducted any raid at all. The convoy simply continued through Wieliczka and disappeared down the southern road, leaving behind nothing but confusion and the growing realization that perhaps, for the first time, Josef's bells had lied. Weber watched the evacuation unfold from his window, confirming everything he had suspected. He saw Anna leave the town hall, tracked her movements through the streets, observed the subtle signals and the rapid dispersal of people who should have been going about their normal business. Most importantly, he now understood the warning pattern. 4 chimes, pause. 4 chimes meant immediate danger, evacuate now. The Hauptsturmführer smiled, not with joy but with the satisfaction of a mathematician who has just solved a particularly elegant proof. He had cracked the code not by intercepting messages or torturing informants, but by creating false data and observing the system's response. Now he possessed the most dangerous knowledge possible. He could speak the language of the bells, could make them say whatever he wanted, could turn Josef's warnings into instruments of betrayal. Over the next 2 weeks, Weber conducted 3 more false alarm operations, each one slightly different, each one designed to map additional patterns in the bell code system. He learned that 3 rapid chimes followed by 2 deep tolls meant Gestapo from the east, that alternating bells indicated routine patrol, that the absence of certain traditional sequences could itself convey meaning. But more importantly, he observed that the resistance trusted the bells absolutely, that they evacuated without questioning, without verification, without the paranoid double-checking that usually characterized underground operations. This trust was the weakness Weber intended to exploit, because trust, once established, becomes a weapon in the hands of those willing to abuse it. The Hauptsturmführer began planning his masterpiece, a raid so perfectly timed, so completely unexpected, that it would destroy the resistance network in a single night, and at the center of his plan was Josef Novak, the bell ringer who would unwittingly become the instrument of his own network's destruction. The night of October 15, 1943, began like any other evening in occupied Wieliczka, with the 6 o'clock Angelus ringing across a town, settling into the uneasy darkness of curfew. Josef pulled the ropes with his damaged hands, executing the traditional sequence perfectly, because there was nothing unusual to report. The roads had been quiet all day, the German patrols following their predictable routes, the headquarters showing no signs of unusual activity. He had watched through the afternoon with growing relief, grateful for a day without crisis, without the terrible weight of deciding who would live and who would die based on the timing of his warnings. After the final bell faded into silence, Josef descended the stairs slowly, his knees protesting every step, and made his way to the small room behind the sacristy where he had been sleeping for the past 6 months. He was asleep within minutes, the exhausted collapse of a man who had been running on adrenaline and duty for half a year. What Josef did not know, could not have known, was that Weber had spent 2 weeks choreographing this night with the precision of a conductor preparing for a symphony. The Hauptsturmführer had deliberately maintained normal operations all day, ensuring that nothing would trigger Josef's instincts or cause him to ring any warnings. But at 22 hours, well after the last scheduled bell ringing, and after Josef would presumably be asleep, Weber deployed his forces in a coordinated operation that involved 73 SS soldiers, 12 Gestapo agents, and detailed maps marking every safe house, every hiding place, every cellar and attic where the resistance had concealed refugees over the past months. The intelligence had been gathered through the false alarm operations, through watching where people ran when the bells warned them to flee, through mapping the network by observing its reactions to manufactured threats. Now Weber was ready to harvest what he had planted. The raids began simultaneously across the old quarter at 22:30 hours, time to catch people in their deepest sleep, when reaction times are slowest and confusion is greatest. Doors were smashed open with rifle butts and sledgehammers, families dragged from beds, cellars and attics invaded by soldiers with flashlights and trained dogs. The Lewandowski family, hidden behind the false wall in the bakery, had no warning before the wall was demolished and they were pulled into the street in their nightclothes. The Rosenberg children in the coal shed had no time to run before the shed was surrounded, and they were captured within minutes. Across Wieliczka, the same scene repeated itself in house after house, cellar after cellar, as Weber's forces moved with the efficiency of men following a detailed script. Within 40 minutes, they had arrested 32 Jews who had been in hiding, 17 Polish families who had sheltered them, and 5 members of the resistance, including Anna Wojcik, who was caught trying to burn documents in her apartment before the soldiers broke down her door. Josef woke to the sounds of screaming and gunfire, his mind struggling to process what was happening. He ran to the window of his small room and saw the chaos unfolding in the streets below, trucks with searchlights, soldiers dragging people from homes, the unmistakable signs of a massive coordinated raid. His first instinct was to run to the tower, to ring the warning bells. But even in his panic, he understood the terrible mathematics of the situation. The raid was already underway, the arrests already happening, and any warning now would only confirm to the Germans that the bells were being used for resistance communication. Josef stood at the window, paralyzed by horror and helplessness, watching the network he had protected for 6 months being systematically destroyed, while his bells remained silent in their tower, useless instruments that could no longer save anyone. By midnight, the operation was complete, and Weber stood in the town square surrounded by his prisoners, who knelt in rows with their hands bound behind their backs. The Hauptsturmführer made a point of looking up at St. Clement's Church, at the dark tower where Joseph's bells hung silent, and he smiled. He had won not through torture or brutality, but through patience and understanding, by learning the language of his enemy and using it against them. The bells that had saved so many had betrayed them all in the end, not through any fault of Joseph's, but through the simple fact that trust, once established, creates predictable behavior, and predictable behavior can be exploited by anyone smart enough to recognize the pattern. Weber had turned the resistance's greatest strength into their fatal weakness, and now he was ready for the final act of his operation, making an example that would echo across occupied Poland and ensure that no one would ever again dare to use church bells as instruments of defiance. Dawn came to Wieliczka on October 16th, with the kind of cold clarity that makes every detail sharp and unforgiving. Josef had not slept after witnessing the raid, had instead spent the night in his tower, watching the headquarters across the square, where lights burned continuously and screams occasionally pierced the silence when interrogations became violent. He knew what was coming, had known from the moment he understood that Weber had outmaneuvered him, that the game was over and the price would be extracted in blood. At 7 in the morning, 2 SS soldiers climbed the 147 steps to the bell tower and found Josef sitting calmly beside his ropes, his hands folded in his lap, looking like a man who had already made peace with whatever came next. They did not beat him or drag him down the stairs, simply informed him in broken Polish that Hauptsturmführer Weber requested his presence at the headquarters immediately. Weber's office was on the 2nd floor of the requisitioned manor house, a room with high ceilings and windows that overlooked both the town square and St. Clement's Church. When Josef was brought in, the Hauptsturmführer was standing at the window, his back to the door, and he did not turn around for a full minute, letting the silence build like pressure in a sealed container. When he finally faced Josef, his expression was not triumphant or cruel, but something worse, professionally satisfied, like a craftsman admiring a job well done. Weber spoke in fluent Polish, his university education evident in his precise grammar, and he laid out everything he had discovered about the bell code system with the thoroughness of a professor delivering a lecture. He explained how he had identified the pattern, how he had tested his hypothesis with false convoys, how he had mapped the resistance network by watching people flee from warnings that meant nothing. He wanted Josef to understand that he had not been caught through betrayal or accident, but through simple intellectual superiority. Then Weber made his offer, delivered with the casual tone of someone discussing business arrangements rather than life and death. Josef could cooperate, could provide the names of everyone involved in the resistance network, could testify that Father Tomasz had coerced him into using the bells against his will, and in exchange, Weber would ensure his execution was quick and relatively painless, a bullet rather than the slow strangulation of a noose or the extended agony of torture. The Hauptsturmführer was offering Josef the opportunity to die as an informant rather than as a hero, to save himself hours or days of suffering by betraying everyone who had trusted him. Weber even showed Josef a list he had compiled, names and addresses of suspected resistance members, and asked him simply to confirm or correct the information as if verification of mass murder was a trivial administrative task. Josef looked at the list, recognizing names of people he had known for decades, families he had watched grow, children he had seen baptized in the church below his tower. He looked at Weber, at this educated man who had turned mathematics into a weapon and intelligence into an instrument of genocide, and Josef understood in that moment that there were fates worse than death. He could die as himself, as the bell ringer who had saved lives and fought back against the machinery of evil in the only way available to him, or he could die as something broken and corrupted, a collaborator whose last act was to destroy the very people he had spent 6 months protecting. The choice was not difficult, though the consequences would be terrible. Josef looked Weber in the eye and spoke his first word since entering the office, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his damaged hands. He told the Hauptsturmführer that he knew nothing about any resistance network, that he had simply been ringing bells according to church tradition, and that Weber could do whatever he wanted, but would get no cooperation, no names, no validation of his theories. Weber's expression did not change, but something cold and final settled in his eyes. He nodded to the soldiers flanking Josef and gave instructions in German that Josef understood even without translation. They would start with the priest, with Father Tomasz, and they would torture him in the square where Josef could watch from his cell. They would break Anna in the basement, where her screams would echo through the building. They would execute the families one by one, until Josef provided the information Weber wanted. And if Josef remained silent, they would make his death last days instead of minutes, would turn his dying into a public spectacle that would terrify the entire town into submission. The Hauptsturmführer was offering Josef a choice between his own suffering and the suffering of everyone he cared about, between his integrity and their survival. And both men knew that there was no correct answer to this equation, no solution that did not result in horror piled upon horror, until the very concept of mercy became a distant memory. The executions began at noon on October 17th in the town square, timed with deliberate symbolism to coincide with the hour when Josef would normally ring the Angelus bells. Weber had ordered a gallows constructed overnight, a crude but functional wooden structure that could accommodate 3 nooses simultaneously, and he had positioned it directly in front of St. Clement's Church so that the condemned would die looking at the building that had been the source of their hope. Josef was forced to watch from a barred window in the headquarters, his wrists bound, 2 guards ensuring he could not look away or close his eyes. The first to die was Father Tomasz Kowalski, who walked to the gallows with a dignity that Weber had not expected, refusing the blindfold and speaking prayers in Latin that carried across the square even as the noose was placed around his neck. The priest's last words were not a curse or a plea, but a blessing directed at Josef's window, a final act of forgiveness for a bell ringer who bore no guilt but would carry the weight of survival. Anna Wojcik died next, and her execution broke something in Josef that all of Weber's threats had not managed to touch. She was 23 years old, had worked with the resistance since the occupation began, and had spent her brief life fighting against a darkness that should never have existed. As the soldiers positioned her on the gallows, she did not pray or cry, but instead began singing a Polish folk song, a melody that children learned from their mothers, a tune that spoke of forests and freedom, and a Poland that existed before borders and occupiers. Her voice was clear and defiant, carrying across the silent square where hundreds of townspeople had been forced to watch, and even when the trap dropped and the noose tightened, the song continued for a few terrible seconds before ending in a silence more complete than Josef had ever known. Watching her die, Josef understood that Weber's victory was absolute, that the bell code system had not just failed, but had been turned into a weapon that killed the very people it was meant to protect. Over the next 3 days, Weber executed 17 more prisoners in groups of 3, spacing the hangings throughout the day to maximize their psychological impact on both Josef and the town. Each execution was choreographed to break a different part of the community spirit. Families hung together so that parents watched children die or children watched parents. Resistance members executed in the order they had joined the network. Jewish families killed last so they would spend days knowing their turn was coming. Weber forced Josef to watch every single death, denying him food or sleep, ensuring that the bell ringer's last memories would be of the people he had failed to save. The Hauptsturmführer was not simply executing prisoners, but constructing a narrative, telling a story about the futility of resistance and the consequences of defying German authority, using bodies as punctuation marks in a text written for an audience of terrified Poles who would remember this lesson for the rest of their lives. On the morning of October 20th, Weber came to Josef's cell and informed him that the executions were complete, that 32 people had died as a direct result of the bell ringers' resistance activities, and that Josef's own execution would take place at noon. But there was a final twist, a last cruelty that demonstrated the depths of Weber's calculated malice. Josef would not be hung in the square like the others, but would instead die in his bell tower, and before his death he would ring the bells one final time in a pattern that Weber would dictate. The Hauptsturmführer had written out a specific sequence, a combination of rings that would signal to any surviving resistance members that it was safe to come out of hiding, that the raids were over, that they could return to their homes. It was a trap, of course, a final use of the bell code system to draw out anyone who had escaped the initial roundup, and Weber was giving Josef the choice to either cooperate and lure his friends to their deaths or refuse and die, knowing that the bells themselves, his life's work, would remain silent forever. Josef was taken to the tower at 11:30, climbing the 147 steps for what he knew would be the last time. His hands could barely grip the ropes anymore, the arthritis and the injuries from months of constant use having degraded them to the point where every movement was agony. Weber stood in the tower with him, along with 4 soldiers and a translator, and he explained in precise detail what would happen. Josef would ring the sequence Weber had written, the false all-clear signal, and then he would be shot and his body would be left hanging from the bell tower as a warning visible from every corner of Wieliczka. Or Josef could refuse, in which case Weber would simply shoot him immediately and then have one of his soldiers ring the bells anyway, meaning Josef's death would accomplish nothing except denying him the chance to touch his beloved ropes one final time. The Hauptsturmführer had constructed a scenario where every choice led to the same outcome, where even the illusion of agency was revealed as another form of torture. Josef stood in his tower surrounded by the instruments that had defined his entire adult life, and in that moment of absolute crisis, he made a decision that Weber had not anticipated, because it required a kind of courage that existed beyond the Hauptsturmführer's mathematical understanding of human behavior. Josef looked at the ropes, at the bells that had sung for baptisms and weddings and funerals, that had marked time for 3 decades, that had saved lives for 6 impossible months, and he understood that he had one final message to send. His hands closed around the ropes, and instead of ringing the sequence Weber had dictated, Josef began to toll a pattern that had not been heard in Wieliczka for over 200 years. The alarm pattern used during the Swedish invasions, a rapid, chaotic clanging of all 3 bells simultaneously, that signified not a specific threat, but absolute catastrophe, total danger, the kind of warning that meant flee now and ask questions never. It was a sound that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to ancestral memory, a noise designed to trigger panic and immediate evacuation. Weber understood what was happening within seconds and screamed orders to his soldiers, but Josef did not stop. Even as bullets tore through his body, even as his blood splattered across the ancient ropes and his legs gave out beneath him, he held on and continued pulling with the last strength remaining in his ruined hands. The bells screamed their warning across Wieliczka, a sound so primal and terrifying that people who heard it dropped whatever they were doing and ran without knowing why, driven by an instinct older than rational thought. The few resistance members who had escaped the initial raids heard those bells and understood that Josef was telling them not to trust anything, not to believe any signal, that the code was compromised, and the only safety was in complete disappearance. By the time Josef's hands finally released the ropes and his body crumpled to the tower floor, he had rung his last warning, and it was perhaps the most honest message he had ever sent. There is no safety here, there is no salvation, there is only the necessity of resistance even when resistance means death. The story of Josef Novak ends in that tower, but the implications of his choice ripple forward through time in ways that demand our attention today. Weber had won the tactical battle, had destroyed the resistance network and executed dozens of people, but Josef's final act of defiance meant that the bell code system died with integrity intact rather than being turned into a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. In the immediate aftermath, the chaos caused by Josef's alarm bells allowed 3 resistance members to escape Wieliczka entirely, and they carried the story of the bell ringer with them as they joined partisan groups in the forests. After the war, when survivors returned to rebuild their shattered town, they commissioned a plaque in St. Clement's Church that read simply, "Josef Novak, bell ringer, who made music into weapon and silence into victory." The bells themselves were damaged by bullet holes and blood, and the church chose never to repair them, leaving the scars visible as a reminder of what had happened in that tower. What strikes me most powerfully about Josef's story is the impossible mathematics of resistance under occupation. He saved lives, dozens of them, maybe more, but in the end, those same efforts led to arrests and executions when the system was turned against itself. So the question we have to ask ourselves, the question that has no comfortable answer, is this: was Josef's resistance worth it? Did the lives saved during those 6 months justify the deaths that came when the network was compromised? I believe the answer is yes, but not for the reasons you might think. Josef's value was not purely in the tactical success of saving specific individuals, but in the demonstration that resistance itself was possible, that even an old man with arthritic hands and no weapons could fight back against the machinery of genocide. In a world designed to crush hope and enforce compliance through terror, every act of defiance, even those that end in failure, becomes a form of victory because it proves that submission is a choice rather than an inevitability. Think about the position Weber put Josef in during those final minutes: ring the false signal and betray everyone, or refuse and die knowing the bells would be silenced forever. Most analyses of this moment focus on Josef's courage in choosing his chaotic alarm instead, but I want you to consider something else. Josef understood that he was going to die, regardless of what he chose, that Weber had constructed a trap with no escape, and yet he still found a way to communicate truth in his final breath. That kind of defiance, that refusal to accept the false choices offered by oppressors, is the heart of resistance that actually matters. Weber thought he understood human behavior, thought he could predict and control responses through fear and manipulation, but he failed to account for the possibility that someone might choose chaos over compliance, might destroy the system rather than allow it to be corrupted. This is the lesson that echoes across decades. When faced with impossible choices constructed by evil, sometimes the only moral response is to reject the premise entirely and create a third option that your oppressor never imagined. So I want to leave you with this question, and I want you to really sit with it. If you were in that tower with bullets about to end your life, with the ropes in your hands and the knowledge that your next action would be your last, what would you ring? Would you have the courage to choose defiance over obedience, chaos over control, even knowing it would change nothing about your own fate? Josef Novak was not a soldier or a spy or anyone histo. WWII would have remembered under normal circumstances. He was a bell ringer with bad knees and worse hands, a man whose entire significance came from recognizing that his ordinary position gave him extraordinary opportunity. The truth that we need to carry forward is this: resistance is not reserved for heroes or warriors, but is available to anyone willing to use whatever tools they possess, whether those tools are bells or words, or simply the refusal to cooperate with their own degradation. Josef's bells are silent now, scarred and still, but the message they rang on that final morning continues to echo across time. Even in the darkest moments of human cruelty, even when the mathematics of survival seem impossible, the choice to resist remains available to anyone brave enough, or desperate enough, or angry enough to reach for it.